Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I deem it a great honor to be invited to make a presentation to this august body concerned with the alleviation of climate change and the pursuit of climate justice, especially as these relate to the interests and well-being of small developing nations. The images we have of the Caribbean reflect the ultimate ideas of paradise: friendly people, lush green hills, beautiful white sand beaches, and aqua seas. The location and resources of the territories made them attractive to exploitation by European colonizers such as Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal. And even in the current context, one can see the exerting political control and influence of countries such as the United States of America in subtly determining fiscal and financial policies for the region, and the low level of environmental concerns that they showed toward insular states, especially since they, along with other countries, contribute significantly to the global crisis that we now face. However, beyond the standard images of glossy brochures, the 43.7 million people of the Caribbean islands, like all other small island developing states, are facing the impact of climate change and health and economic factors, which are both legacies of colonialism and the influence of wealthy and politically strong-willed countries across the world. Over the last 30 years, average temperatures in the Caribbean region have increased by 0.1 degree to 0.2 degrees Celsius, and sea level rise has occurred at a rate of about 2 to 4 centimeters per decade. Rainfall patterns have shifted, with the number of consecutive dry days expected to increase. And we have also seen hurricanes, which are more powerful, destructive, frequent, and even forming outside the predicted hurricane season. This trend presents risks to the region's freshwater resources for domestic use, the growth of crops, and the rearing of animals for the agricultural sector, with impact on our food security and the coastal populations that are dependent on tourism and agricultural produce for their survival. Projections indicate that losses to the tourism sector from climate change could total US $22 billion annually by the year 2050. While small island developing states are the smallest contributors to global greenhouse gas emissions, their population, biodiversity, and resources are the most at risk, being threatened by recurrent natural disasters, with the Caribbean being 7 times more likely to be impacted than any other region. Since 1995, there has been an increase in the intensity and distribution of hurricanes in the Caribbean. The number of Category 4 and 5 hurricanes have increased over 50% in the past 20 years. Large-scale agricultural losses are not unusual, as more than half of the countries in the sub-region depend on 1 or 2 commodities for export revenues. In 2007, Hurricane Dean destroyed all of Jamaica's major export crops and severely impacted the agricultural sectors of Haiti, Dominica, and St. Lucia. In addition to the 69 lives lost, the estimated cost of Hurricane Dorian's impact on the Bahamas in 2019 is $3.4 billion. Non-communicable diseases such as diabetes and hypertension have become the leading cause of death in most islands. The non-Latin Caribbean has the highest mortality rate due to cardiovascular diseases in the Americas. accounting for 418 per 100,000 population. There are indications that Caribbean people are predisposed to these conditions due to centuries of high salt and sugar diets during the time of enslavement. There's also the reality of increased temperatures, which contribute to health issues such as cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. Additionally, we have been impacted by mosquito-borne diseases such as chikungunya, Zika, and dengue fever, conditions that are likely to be increased during the periods of increased rainfall, which have now become more unpredictable as countries fail to manage breeding sites because of limited resources. Like the rest of the world, the COVID-19 pandemic has not only stretched our limited health resources in terms of the availability of essential equipment and supplies, but also in terms of personnel. Shortages of nurses and other health professionals are widespread across our region. After they are trained locally, healthcare professionals are recruited to work in first world countries where they are offered remuneration and better packages which we are unable to match at home. Mitigation and adaptation strategies may be employed across the region to combat the impact of climate change. Renewable electricity projects, clean energy, and vehicle emission and importation policies are some of the major strategies being applied to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector. The protection and conservation of existing forests continues to be a priority, as well as the need to recreate those that have been destroyed. From a faith-based perspective, this is where the 5 marks of mission of the Anglican Communion takes on the character of a mandate for Christians, namely, to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. We know that the major greenhouse emission is carbon dioxide, and green plants, especially trees, are the organisms that absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So the more trees we cut down, the less carbon dioxide that will be absorbed. The more trees we replant, the greater the absorption of carbon dioxide. Consequently, this will result in a decrease of the average global temperatures. Additionally, we need to encourage the practice of seeing God in creation. Many Christians have been losing touch with this aspect of Christian identity. When Christians are able to value and see God in creation, we will be able to recognize the need to protect and preserve the same as stewards of all that God has created. With humanity contributing greatly to the greenhouse gas carbon dioxide that is emitted via the burning of carbon-based fossil fuels to run motor vehicles and factories, and even electrical plants that produce electricity for our homes and churches, there needs to be a greater appreciation of how our lifestyle is contributing to the increase in levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. With trees being the only organism to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, we should therefore recognize the need to protect the remaining forests and take collective action to prevent the kind of deforestation taking place in the Amazon basin and in other parts of the world, to make space for the planting of palm oil producing plants. Advocacy for the protection of people who are most vulnerable to the impact of climate change remains an imperative. This includes persons who live on coastal areas. With increased average global temperatures, sea levels are rising, and as a result, low-lying countries will eventually become flooded. This will therefore result in loss of property and the eventual movement of such persons further inland. farmers will have a greater challenge growing their crops. Vulnerability to extreme heat will lead to medical conditions. Advocacy for the pursuit of best practices which seek to mitigate and reduce the causes associated with global warming must become a priority. This may include the gradual conversion of our electricity grid, which burns fossil fuels, to renewable energy sources, and the promotion of wider use of renewable energy sources for householders and businesses by the provision of subsidies and reduction in taxes on equipment and motor vehicles. The region requires assistance in its efforts, and so technology transfer, capacity building in flood risk, watershed, ocean and coastal management, and the education and training of locals on climate impacts and adaptation are very important if it is that we are to have an effective climate change reduction and mitigation model. We cannot negate the fact that global warming caused by other countries has a greater impact on poorer and smaller countries of the world, such as those in the Caribbean. Yet what happens in one part of the world affects those in other parts of the world, and the greenhouse gases produced by such countries are no different. Consequently, small islands, such as those in the Caribbean, should be able to benefit from a fund to which these larger countries contribute, which will help us to do more to address the environmental impact facing us. There have been similar efforts as encouraged by the G7 summits, but according to Roger Harabin, a BBC environmental analyst, for the umpteenth time, the Rich Club has failed to deliver on its promise to channel 100 billion a year to poor nations coping with a heating climate. Such funds should also be provided to help to mitigate and alleviate the impact of the climate crisis, such as reforestation of our dead forests, providing employment to poor countries to replant and nurture dead forests, and the promotion of planting fruit trees from which generations to come can benefit. Advocating for such funding to be provided by these developed nations of the world is very important, but loans are not what should be provided, but grants. Unfortunately, according to Harbin, the majority of what has been provided so far has been in the form of loans, which are pushing vulnerable countries further into debt and poverty. The G7 countries should also be challenged to take additional steps to reduce their carbon emissions and seek to implement policies that will help to use less fossil fuel and more alternative forms of energy. Their failure to do this will have a devastating effect on our world. The Church has a crucial role to play in challenging the powers that be in order to encourage the change that is necessary to address the climate crisis with which we are faced, in fulfillment of the fourth mark of mission, that is, to transform unjust structures of society, to challenge violence of every kind, and pursue peace and reconciliation. It is for such reasons that religious communities are encouraged to come together to lobby and petition government officials to take the necessary steps to address issues of climate change in our Caribbean countries, to create alliances at the national and regional level with various stakeholders, including the faith-based communities, and to further encourage our leaders to engage these developed nations to provide much needed assistance to smaller countries in the world who are greatly impacted by climate change. The Church must, however, demonstrate its commitment to the alleviation of climate change and the pursuit of climate justice by demonstrating its commitment to the undertaking of best practices in its community and institutional life. This would include efforts to green our buildings and operation, educate our congregations to recognize the roles they can play to mitigate climate change and to be a source of advocacy for the protection of the environment and those who are greatly impacted. At the denominational and ecumenical levels, there can be a commitment to invest in and encourage the use of alternative forms of energy, such as solar panels and wind technology, in order to cut down or reduce our reliance on the need for electricity produced by these fossil fuels and electricity plants. As the Church, we remain committed to the task of addressing the issue of climate change so as to ensure the flourishing of all God's people, especially those who are most impacted. This we are encouraged to do by partnering with the government, NGOs, and other religious organizations in order to address this environmental concern. It is our hope that this conference will provide not only a forum for airing our common concerns, but the building of a global coalition for advocacy and action that will address the challenge to our humanity and the environment as stewards of God's creation.